Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 deals with listening more than meets the ear. In this chapter, we will be talking about many of the challenges that exist in terms of effective listening and ways that we can work to be better listeners in our routine conversations with other people. So let's get started. To begin with, it's worth distinguishing the difference between the physical process of hearing versus the cognitive emotional process of listening. So in terms of hearing, basically the process of hearing is a physical process whereby there are sound waves striking the eardrum, and of course we learn to make sense and interpret those sound waves based on how we have been socialized and trained, and also based on the symbols that we have come to agree upon socially that we know represent certain ideas. So the reason that you are listening to this lecture and it has meaning for you in this moment here is because you are competent and proficient in the English language. However, if you were not proficient in the English language, the hearing process would not be as comprehensible to you in this scenario, because much of what I am saying right now probably would not be easily understood by you. So that's a good example for distinguishing how the process of hearing is not necessarily the same as effectively making sense of what you're hearing so that you can listen. Now, listening, of course, deals with the brain interpreting noise to form meaning. So in terms of hearing versus listening, many of us have been in situations before where we have been pseudo-listening or hearing but not listening to people. I have had students tell me about these scenarios before where they are just sort of tuning out to a conversation, and sometimes people will stop what they're saying and they might ask you a question like, well, what do you think about that? Or what do you think of what I've been saying? And there's nothing like a question like that to bring you back to the moment, to realize that, oh, well, maybe I have been tuning out mentally and I haven't really been giving this person the full attention that is required here to be an effective listener. So hopefully in this chapter, we're going to be able to talk about some of the barriers that keep us from really being good listeners and ways that we can work to circumvent those barriers or minimize those barriers so that we can be effective listeners. In terms of the various elements that are involved in the listening process, it starts out, as we stated in the previous slide, with the physical process of hearing. And again, these are the sound waves that are hitting the eardrums so that we can make sense of the words that people are using. However, the second process of listening involves the psychological aspect, which is the information that we attend to, or how we make sense of the information that we have heard. And of course, there are many things that can influence which pieces of information we attend to, what pieces of information we listen to more than others, and the ways that we interpret these various pieces of information. There has been a lot of research done on listening and effective listening, and what the research tends to show is that we tend to pay more attention and listen to information more when it is relevant to our needs or our wants or the things that we desire in a given situation or in a long-term situation. So, for example, if you are listening to a friend of yours talk about some of the experiences that they've had this week at school, and perhaps you're thinking about taking a class from the same professor that they are talking about, because this is an area where you would have a vested interest in the future, chances are you would probably attend more to the information that they're sharing with you about that particular professor than you would to just random thoughts that they had about, what it's like being on campus, how their summer was, other professors maybe that they might be talking about. So the different types of motivations and needs that we have will shape the way that we make sense of information. In addition, we tend to go through the process of understanding. And so understanding clearly is a cognitive and somewhat emotional process, I would say. And so understanding involves the way that we make sense of the information. So there are various things that can shape how we make sense of a message. There are things like how much information do we have already about the topic that can shape how we make sense of something or how we understand something. We might also have information about that person that is doing the speaking. So we might have background information about the person. We might have specific life information about what that person's going through, which of course can influence how we understand the way that they communicate in that moment. And once we understand a message, then we move into the response phase, which is basically the ways that we can respond through verbal and nonverbal communication to provide observable feedback to the people with which we are listening. Now, in some situations, there is really not any feedback required. And so you can think about, for example, when you're listening to the radio or when you're listening to the television or watching a film or a commercial on television, or maybe a web speech or a web show or something like that. In these situations, because they are mass media communication, there is really no aspect of response that's necessary or expected. However, in routine communication between people or with communication between an individual and groups of people, these types of situations tend to have an expectation that good listening will also be attended to by response, effective responses. So we're going to talk about this in this lecture, and hopefully this will provide some useful information for you in terms of how to provide observable feedback in these various situations we find ourselves in where we are expected to be good listeners. As we discussed at the beginning of this slideshow, in many situations we will find ourselves at some point engaging in what's called mindless listening. Mindless listening is the tendency that we have to react to statements without paying too much attention to what is being said. The process of mindless listening is not something that is actually that abnormal. And if you find yourself in these kinds of situations, it's certainly not something that I suggest that you feel bad about, because all human beings engage in mindless listening simply because it's a valuable mental heuristic shortcut for processing information. So if you think about your communication with other people on a day-to-day basis, we go through so many different types of situations, talking with different people about different topics, and we listen to the radio, we listen to the television, we listen to shows we're watching on TV, and really, we don't really have the mental spare energy to engage in 100% mindful listening in every kind of listening situation that we ever find ourselves in, right? So given that we know that mindless listening is actually a valuable mental heuristic, which allows us to process information on a low level, right, which contributes to the experience of interacting with people without feeling overwhelmed by too much information, okay? So considering that mindless listening is a very human process and a normal process at that, the best thing that we can do is to start to, first of all, acknowledge or be able to talk about what is mindless listening. Second of all, it's good for us to figure out in what kinds of situations we do mindless listening, because sometimes we might be engaging in mindless listening, and in reality, we should be paying careful attention because these conversations may be very important to us in various ways. So it's good to figure out what mindless listening is and what does it look like for you, because every person might have certain types of situations where they tune out. And so figure out what kinds of situations do you engage in mindless listening, and which situations do you need to minimize mindless listening because it's important for you to be aware of the information, or because somebody needs you to be mindful and engaged with them, right? So for example, obviously we want to avoid mindless listening whenever we're talking with people in our close family systems or close friends, especially about topics that are of importance to people. This is when we really want to give people the gift of our full attention, right? So figure out, what does mindless listening look like for you? In what situations do you engage in mindless listening? And in what kinds of situations would you like to work on minimizing mindless listening so that you can be more present and available to people, and also for your own benefit, right? Because if you tune out and miss information that could influence your future, that could also have a negative effect on you. So mindless listening is a normal process. As I said before, it's a valuable mental heuristic, and there are several examples that we can come up with where we might have engaged in mindless listening. One of these examples could be an over detailed account of a conversation that one of your friends or family members might be providing. Maybe you've heard the story before. Maybe you feel like they're providing information or details that are, it's too much information in that moment for you to really process. So that would be an example of when you might find yourself doing it. But as I stated before, we also tend to engage in mindless listening during listening to the radio, or maybe public discussions, or maybe even classroom situations. We might find ourselves engaging in mindless listening because we're not really expected to have to reiterate back to the speaker what they've said, right? We're not really being placed in a situation where it's expected that we will respond in any tangible way. So any kind of like lectures or listening to the radio or advertisements, these tend to be a tempting situation to sort of tune out and engage in mindless listening. Now, in comparison to mindless listening, mindful listening is a very different animal. So mindful listening allows us to pay careful attention and thought and consideration to the messages that we hear. We tend to pay more attention to people who are speaking or to messages when they are messages that have some important relevance to our life, which of course makes a lot of sense. So for example, people tend to be more mindful about paying attention or listening carefully when there are important relational issues that someone is discussing. We also tend to pay attention when there are financial issues being discussed, because as many of us know, finance and finance issues tend to be a very important part of living a functional, productive life, right? You have to be able to manage finances effectively. So you might tend to notice you're more mindful with these types of situations. And again, in certain types of situations that are more dire or important or serious, we might also give more attention to people, and we might engage in more mindful listening in these situations. So in order to make sure that we understand some of the ways that we tune out in terms of our listening, let's look at some of the ineffective listening strategies that have been found to take place when human beings communicate. One of the first type of ineffective listening approaches, and I'm sure many of you have experience with this, either in terms of your own experience or maybe somebody else did it to you. One of the first is pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening is basically fake listening, pretend listening. You are actually putting an act on for the other person that allows the other person to think that you are paying attention to them when in actuality you are not. So we might do things in an interpersonal conversation, for example. We might do things like make eye contact with the person. We might nod for the person, right? Nod your head up and down to pretend like you understand. We might actually make vocal sounds like uh-huh or oh, so that the person thinks that we're actually paying attention. Now, in reality, if we are pseudo-listening, we're not really paying attention to what the person is saying. We're actually doing things mentally that are not listening, right? So we're doing things like we're ruminating about the conversation we had the night before with a friend or a family member. We're thinking of the grocery list that we have to pick up at the grocery store before we pick our kids up from school. We're thinking of that, teacher we had last semester and how great their class was and why can't we have that teacher for every class or, whatever, right? So pseudo-listening is a very interesting, actually, human dynamic. It's a human tendency that I find very interesting. And in terms of the research on cognitive energy and psychological effort, what's interesting about pseudo-listening is that it actually takes more energy than simply just tuning out and not listening to somebody. So it shows you that even in the presence of pseudo-listening, people are still aware of the fact that they are expected to pay attention. And so they put on this drama or this sort of theatrical performance to convince the other person that they're listening when in actuality they're not. The second type of ineffective listening strategy that many of you, I'm sure, have experienced before communicating with other people is stage hogging. So when we encounter people who do stage hogging, what we find is that they may interrupt and they may shift response. So for example, you might start a conversation by saying something like, oh yeah, you're talking to your roommate, and you come in after school and you're talking to your roommate and you're sharing with them how, you had a really challenging day because you're finding some of your new classes to be more of a time commitment than you expected. And so you're trying to figure out how to manage this in terms of, creating a schedule and having everything in a planner so that you can make sure that you're giving everything the amount of time that's required. Now, if somebody is really paying attention and listening effectively to that statement, what they would say in response would probably be something like, "Oh, wow. Well, it sounds like you're really up for a challenge this semester, and how do you plan to handle that? And, it sounds like what you're planning to do are some good ideas. Have you thought of any other ideas that you could use to try to manage these these time demands that you have," right? That would be like a typical desired response if you were sharing that topic to somebody. A stage hogger, though, will not do that. What they will do is they will say to you, "Oh, yeah, you know what? That reminds me of the time when I was working over at Winco, and boy, I had so many people I had to manage, and I had to have a schedule and this and that. And that reminds me of, this idea that a lot of people are not very respectful of my time and this and that." So a stage hogger will interrupt, and they will also shift the topic under discussion. Usually they will shift the topic so that the topic is a topic addressing them or their experience or their life. Now, in some situations, people may try to empathize with you by referencing a situation that they went through, which reminds them of what they're hearing, right? And that is shared a little bit differently than stage hogging. But basically, a stage hogging response is one that seeks to interrupt, and it seeks to take over the stage, if you will, so that that person can start talking about what they want to talk about rather than listening effectively. And it could sound like this: "Well, you think you have it bad. Well, let me tell you about my situation," and then they go into what their situation is. And so how does it feel for us when we are speaking and somebody is pseudo listening or stage hogging? Well, it doesn't feel very good, right? We don't feel that we're being validated. We don't feel that our opinion is really being considered or listened to. And so these types of situations are really good for remembering in terms of situations where we have been on the receiving end of ineffective listening. Because when you think back to a time when you were on the receiving end of someone who really wasn't paying attention to you, for example, and how that felt, both psychologically and emotionally, it gives us some empathy, right? And so what that does is it allows us to want to be a better listener for people in the future. A third type of ineffective listening is selective listening. Selective listening takes place when people choose to respond to some comments and refuse or avoid responding to other comments. Obviously, when we are engaging in selective listening, it is not ideal in relationships because what it conveys to other people is that we are choosing to ignore certain topics. And what we know from the relational communication literature is that good relationships, effective, solid, happy, satisfying relationships, are the kinds of relationships where we don't have topic avoidance going on. And so if you are in a relationship or having a conversation with someone and they are consistently using selective listening, then it's likely that they are also engaging in some topic avoidance practices, which clearly are not going to be effective for relationships, because if there is a topic that people need to discuss and one person consistently refuses to discuss it, that can lead to a lot of problems, right? Because the issue just keeps getting worse and people don't want to discuss it, and so it does not improve. So selective listening is something to definitely avoid. This would be the case sometimes. Maybe you're having a conversation with someone and you say to them that, maybe you're having some concerns about the relationship, and one of the concerns is this, and then another concern is that. If they choose to respond to one of the concerns, but they purposely or do not respond to the other concern, and they almost pretend like you didn't even say it, then that's what it would look like in a routine conversation. However, with regards to television and radio, we tend to engage in a lot of selective listening because it's necessary, because of the heuristic shortcuts that we've already discussed. So selective listening in terms of television or radio ads can actually serve a very important function. The issue, though, is that sometimes we train our brains or we train our minds to engage in pseudo listening or selective listening, and this might be happening with like media, for example, like television or radio, but then we might apply the same types of listening strategies when we communicate with other people. And that's what we really need to work on avoiding, because as we all know, the television does not need to be responded to, but a person does. Another type of ineffective listening strategy is insulated listening. Insulated listening is similar to selective listening, but insulated listening is basically where somebody pretends like you didn't even mention something, okay? So when a person seems like they don't hear the statement you've said, or they don't even acknowledge the topic, or again, here's this idea of topic avoidance. So we see that insulated listening and selective listening are very similar, okay? And so a good example of insulated listening, let's say you're on a telephone with somebody and it's starting to maybe get late in the evening, and so you say to them, you know, it's been really great visiting with you. I've had a good time talking with you, and I really appreciate that we can stay in touch like this, but I have to get going because I have to get up for work in the morning. And so a person who is engaging in insulated listening might just say, oh yeah, it's great visiting, and I just really love that we can stay connected too. And anyway, so then I was talking to my friend over at work, and they were telling me all about their friends, and so they just keep rambling on, and they don't even acknowledge the fact that you said that you have to get off the phone to go to work in the morning, right? So we can think of situations maybe that we've been in where this has taken place, and of course, obviously, it's a type of ineffective listening, and so whenever possible, we want to really be present for people, which includes responding to the major topics that they introduce rather than using selective listening or insulated listening. Another type of ineffective listening is defensive listening. Defensive listening tends to happen in relationships where there are already relational issues taking place. So one person perhaps does not feel appreciated, or one person feels like another person is constantly criticizing them. Sometimes people have a tendency to hear things in a defensive way, and that could be an individual personality attribute that people have as well. So defensive listening is indicative of an individual tendency, but it also may be indicative of underlying relational issues that are already at play, which can contribute to people interpreting comments as a type of attack. So defensive listening would include if somebody were to make like a request or a statement, such as, I would really appreciate it if you would clean up your dishes more in the sink rather than leaving them for me to clean up when I come home from work, right? So somebody who was engaging in open listening or genuine effective listening would probably interpret that comment and say something like, oh, okay, well, what I'm hearing is that it's frustrating for you to come home from work and find my lunch dishes in the sink and you have to clean them up. So you would really appreciate it if I could clean up my dishes so that when you come home from work, you don't have to have a mess to clean up. And then the person could respond and say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And it's not a really big deal maybe, but I would really appreciate it if you could do that. And so somebody that was not defensive would probably interpret a request like that in a fairly, in a fair way. They would say, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize that was happening, and I understand, and I'm going to work to try to accommodate your needs. If somebody was defensive, they would probably respond with something like, well, you're always criticizing me, and you leave your dishes in the sink too, this and that, okay? So whenever possible, it's good to respond with an open mindset that tells somebody that we're hearing them and we care about what they're saying. Another type of ineffective listening is ambushing. And this happens sometimes when people are trying to build a case against someone else. So like, let's say you already have it in your mind that somebody deserves, to be punished, or they deserve to get reprimanded for something that they've done. So you might ask them a simple question like, so how was work today, right? And they might, very innocently start telling you about what they did at work today. And you might start picking out various things that they did at work that perhaps maybe you have a problem with, or you might start, criticizing them for, talking to certain people, or maybe not calling you enough during work, or, maybe not doing a good enough job at work, whatever, right? So ambushing is clearly not an effective listening strategy. We would hope that we can do whatever we can to minimize the use of defensive listening or ambushing. However, the reality is that human beings are not perfect, and human beings do these kinds of things at some point, okay? So the point behind discussing some of these ineffective listening strategies in a class like this is not to try to make people feel bad for the tendency that they may do this in the future, or that they do it now, or not to make you feel that other people in your life are cruel and mean. But the point is to allow us to become aware of some of the strategies that tend to break down relationships, so that if we see an ineffective listening strategy playing out, especially with regards to our own behavior, we can work to minimize it and hopefully eliminate that ineffective listening, so that we can have better relationships with people that we communicate with. Ambushing is also something that tends to be used a lot in terms of litigation proceedings when a lawyer is trying to build a case. And so they might take a defendant to the stand, and they might ask them questions in the hopes that the person will say too much or say some information that will incriminate them in some way. So the ambushing listening strategy is something that's maybe useful in litigation proceedings. However, in relationships, it is not the suggested or the best practices way to go about communicating. Another type of ineffective listening that is not ideal would be insensitive listening. This type of listening happens when people might respond to fairly superficial comments that a person makes and not respond to the larger issues. So for example, and this relates somewhat to topic avoidance and also to insulated listening and topic choosing. So let's say, for example, that your sister or brother calls you and they start to talk about all of the challenges that they're having at their new job, right? And maybe they mention something about, oh, but living in this area is really beautiful. There's lots of places to go hiking, and we really like the community. However, my job has been really stressful lately. And then they go into all the various stresses, right? So insensitive listening would include not responding to the more substantial topic that's being introduced by them, but instead responding to the relatively superficial comments that are made. So things like, you might respond by saying something like, oh, well, that's great that you love the area. That's really important whenever you move somewhere. And that's so cool that you like the community. And it sounds like you're doing really great, right? And in that situation, you're definitely not listening sensitively, because you're not tuning into the fact that although the person likes the area and although the person enjoys the community, they're struggling with their job, right? So we want to work to try to be sensitive listeners whenever we can. And by the way, this includes listening with our ears and also listening with our eyes. And this is one of the reasons why it's good to have conversations with people whenever possible in person, because we get nonverbal cues when we're in person talking with someone that we don't get when we're talking over the phone or texting or emailing. And of course, insensitive listening involves ignoring nonverbal cues that tell us that people are not doing fine, even though they might verbally tell us they're doing fine. One of the main reasons why we have these listening challenges, or some of the listening challenges we face, is because of message overload. We've talked about why it is that we tend to do pseudo-listening, because it's a heuristic shortcut. And so we can think about the fact that we have a lot of information coming at us on a day-to-day basis. And so there is just a necessity to determine what pieces of information we actually need to spend a lot of mental energy tuning into, and what pieces of information we do not need to spend so much energy listening to. So one major challenge is the fact that most of us on a given day will have many different messages coming to us in terms of relationships or people that we know. But when you add the media in terms of radio, the web, magazines, the newspaper, films, all of these different types of media facets that we tend to consume, right? We simply go into what's considered to be message overload. So it's good to be aware of how much messages or how much information we take in on a daily basis. And if it's something that you think is necessary, maybe we need to start to reduce some of the information we take in so that we can be more mindful to pay attention to people in relationships that we're talking to when we're talking with them, so that we can truly be present to listen effectively. Another challenge to listening is that we oftentimes find ourselves mentally or emotionally preoccupied when we are engaging in a conversation. So you may be having a conversation with your mom or dad about what you're going to do this weekend when they come to visit you. However, you might be mentally preoccupied with what you have to study for a test tomorrow, or you might be emotionally preoccupied with some upsetting news that you got from a friend at school, right? So these are all things that can cause you to not be present and mindful in terms of listening. Another type of listening challenge is the tendency that we have as humans to have rapid thoughts. So what's interesting about the human brain is that we actually tend to engage in a process that is called mental spare time, right? And part of the reason that we tend to mentally tune out when we're listening to people or to media is because we have a lot of mental spare time. So consider the fact that the brain is capable of processing approximately 600 words a minute. And then consider the fact that the average human will speak about 150 words a minute. What this means is that there is a lot of mental spare time with any given conversation, because people know that a person can be talking, right? And you might start to fill in what they're going to say, or you might start to tune out because they talk a little bit slower, right? And so your brain is actually capable of processing much more than the average person speaks, and this can cause people to tune out. In addition to the previous listening challenges that we've discussed, effort can also be a challenge to effective listening. In terms of effort, what's interesting about listening is that in order to truly be engaged with someone, there are physical responses that are required, right? So when I'm effectively listening to a student who's talking to me in my office, I am nodding my head, I am giving the appropriate facial cues so that that student feels that I'm attending to what they're saying. And if there are certain topics that come up, I am adapting my facial cues so that the student understands that I am engaged and that I'm being empathic and sensitive to whatever topics we're discussing, okay? So there is physical effort required in order to be a good listener. However, it's also interesting to note that in terms of internal processes, when people are putting energy into truly listening and closely listening, the heart rate tends to increase, people's physical temperature also tends to increase. So the sheer amount of effort that is required to truly effectively listen to people can sometimes be a deterrent to effective listening. In addition to the other challenges we've talked about, the issue of external noise is something that is an ongoing challenge to effective listening. You might be dealing with hearing the side conversations of people, right, in another room. You may be hearing people talking upstairs or talking downstairs, or you might be hearing people in a classroom that are engaging in side conversation when you're trying to listen to the lecture. You might hear the machines that are that the building or the university is using to run the organization, right? You might hear generators, you might hear the air conditioning or the heat. Perhaps there is some work being done on the street outside. You might hear machines in terms of those things. You might hear traffic, right? Those are different types of external noise barriers or challenges. In addition, another type of external noise that we might not think of as noise would be something like temperature. So if the temperature in the room is getting uncomfortably warm for people or is uncomfortably cold, then people are really not able to engage in effective listening because they are so distracted by the fact that they feel cold or warm. In addition, having faulty assumptions can also decrease our ability to listen effectively. When we have faulty assumptions, we might assume, for example, that the message is too simple for us. Maybe we think we already know what the person's going to say. Maybe we think that we don't have enough information to really process what the person is saying, right? So those types of faulty assumptions can detract from our ability to effectively listen. Another listening challenge can be that there is a perceived lack of advantage to paying attention to someone. Some of us feel that we have more to gain by speaking. Some people think that they have viewpoints or experiences or opinions that should be shared with other people all the time. This can be somewhat challenging when you're trying to engage in a relational discussion with someone, or when you are engaging in a group-based project where participation is required of all people. I'm sure that if you go to any kind of public discussion forum, whether it's a classroom or a meeting or an organizational situation where people are in groups and they're talking, it's fairly easy to identify which people in the group tend to perceive that they have more to gain by speaking. These are usually the people that tend to dominate a lot of the talk space. They talk for longer periods of time. They also sometimes are the people that interrupt other people so that they can take the floor over and keep talking again. And so we want to always be conscious of the fact that every opinion and every viewpoint in a room or in a group discussion is valuable, right? And what happens when we have certain people that tend to dominate discussions or classroom discussions or work discussions or social discussions is that those other viewpoints that tend to be important, just as important, but maybe the people that have the views are not as assertive about getting their ideas out there, those viewpoints tend to become silenced. And so we always want to ask ourselves, what am I speaking for? What is the purpose of me sharing this information? Is this information that I'm sharing because I genuinely think it's going to help this cause? Am I sharing this information because I'm trying to promote a certain type of agenda? Am I sharing this information simply because I think that I'm great and I want people to know how great I am? Am I sharing this information because I think that my opinion is the most important one, right? So these are things that we want to be very careful of. Now, I'm sure many of you have had situations where you can identify someone who appears to have a lack of advantage in terms of listening. And so let's use this awareness and let's use this knowledge in the future so that we can become better listeners by learning how to listen effectively and learning how to draw other people out effectively that may not be as assertive about talking about what they think. Because lots of different viewpoints and lots of different opinions whenever you're discussing a topic is generally an asset in terms of making the best decision possible. So we want to be conscious of the human tendency sometimes to dominate the talk floor, and we want to become more conscious of our own tendency to either dominate the talk floor, or the other side of more to gain by speaking would be not talking, right? So some people don't share anything in the group. They tend to sit back and let everybody do the talking for them, right? This kind of a situation is also not ideal because, again, you're having viewpoints or opinions or perspectives that could be contributing to the awareness in the group and to decision making. And of course, the people that are hanging back and not doing any talking are not getting those opinions out there and not getting those viewpoints out there. So this is definitely something worth considering in relationships, but also in the professional interactions that we find ourselves engaged in. Another listening challenge deals with a lack of training about how to either listen effectively or a lack of training in terms of the actual topic that's being discussed. So this takes place, for example, when somebody perceives that there's a gap between what they actually know and what's being discussed. And so if I, for example, if I go to a talk, a professional speech, and I might find this topic very interesting, but I might get there and realize that I don't know enough background information to really process and listen to what the person's saying, right? This might also cause me to tune out as well. In addition, one of the other listening challenges that is not cognitive or emotional, but is actually physical, would be actual physical hearing challenges. At one point or another, many of us will either know somebody who has a hearing problem, or we ourselves will have hearing problems in life. And this can cause a lot of challenges for people, both the speaker and the listener, because people may not actually hear what you say. They may be trying to pretend like they're hearing what you say, and they're responding in superficial ways because they don't actually know what you said. And so it's very important to try to be conscious whenever there could be a physical hearing challenge. If you do know someone who is consistently engaging in conversations where they don't seem to be hearing information, or they're not hearing sounds that you think they should be hearing, this could be a potential health or safety risk for people. So I suggest that you encourage people like that to maybe get their hearing checked out, and that way they can possibly get assistive technology devices that can help with hearing, which of course will contribute to effective relationships, because as we know, listening is a very important part of effectively relating. And then the final listening challenge that we'll discuss here is media influences. And there have been a lot of researchers that have attempted to look at this issue of the overstimulating media system that we currently have. And so when you turn on the television, or when you go to a film nowadays, what you tend to find is that there is a lot of stimuli, right? So there's a lot of action, and there's a lot of colors, and there's a lot of movement, and there's a lot of music, and there's a lot of violence, and sometimes there's sexual interactions, and there's just a lot of action happening, right? A lot of bells and whistles and colors. And actually, if you look at the films from 50 or 80 years ago, they were so much different, because the ways that people would interact in those films, and the filmmakers themselves would tune into a lot of subtleties about human interactions and human communications that nowadays we don't tend to see in films, right? And so having a media system that trains us to expect overstimulation means that when we do not have a listening situation set up that is very stimulating to us in terms of what the stimuli are, whether it's noise or sound or movement or color or whatever, these types of listening interactions can be less stimulating, and of course can create a tendency to tune out, because in essence, if you become acclimated to more stimulation from the media, then basically it takes more to keep your attention, right? So this is something that all of us can be aware of in terms of the media, and in terms of the potential effect on our ability to effectively relate to other human beings. So now that we've talked about the many ways that we are challenged to be effective listeners, let's briefly discuss some ways that we can work on listening more effectively. One of the first ways that we can work on listening more effectively is simply to talk less. There is probably a reason why human beings have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? We don't tend to think a lot about the physical design of our bodies, but the fact that there are 2 ears and 1 mouth, in my opinion, tells me that perhaps we should be doing more listening than talking. So this is definitely something worth considering. Also, it might surprise you the kinds of things that you end up learning about other people, or the kinds of ideas that other people share, if you just simply create more space for other people to talk. As I've mentioned before in this lecture, when people are consistently talking, there doesn't leave much space for other people to talk. So if we simply scale back on how much we talk, it doesn't mean we have to stop talking. It just means that we don't say every single thought that comes into our mind, right? Simply talking less will allow us to practice listening more effectively, because we won't be talking as much. And as we know, practice can make perfect, right? Practice makes perfect. So I don't think you will become perfect listeners, but I do think that you will improve your skills simply by learning to talk less. And this is something I myself have tried to work on over the years, and I have found it to be a very effective strategy to learn how to really listen more effectively to people. And remember, when we're talking about listening, we're not just talking about what people say, but we're also talking about what they might do, so nonverbal cues as well. In addition, we can do our very best to minimize interrupting and stage hogging. I probably don't need to tell you this, but generally speaking, and I'm sure many of you have been on the receiving end of being interrupted before, generally speaking, when we interrupt other people, it is not considered to be a very good manner. Interrupting is considered to be fairly rude. However, in our modern day society, it is fairly common to interrupt. So this is something that we want to be conscious of, both in terms of our own behavior and in terms of other people's behavior towards us. Generally speaking, when people engage in interrupting and stage hogging, it leaves the other person who has been interrupted feeling as if their opinion is not important. It may lead them to feel invalidated, and it, of course, can contribute to a host of assumptions that people may make about a person who does the interrupting, right? So let's all work on minimizing interrupting and stage hogging whenever possible, which of course goes along with talking less. And ideally, this will allow us to listen more effectively when we relate to people. The second thing that we can do to listen more effectively is to simply eliminate distractions. One major distraction that I tend to find has an issue, or that I tend to find is relevant in today's situation, is the cell phone. It's quite often when I go out to eat, or when I go out shopping, or when I'm in classes teaching, to see people staring at their cell phones. I can't tell you how many times I have gone out to eat with my husband and I have looked around the restaurant and I have seen a family sitting together, and the mom and the dad are both on their cell phones separately, and the kid is either on their cell phone or they're sitting there staring at the mom and the dad while the parents are tuning out looking at their cell phones. Obviously, having your cell phone with you 24/7 and responding to every single text or update you might get is a major distraction to really being an effective listener. So you can think about ways and methods for potentially minimizing the likelihood that your cell phone use can negatively impact your ability to really listen effectively. And if you feel like this is something that you want to work on, I'm sure that there are a whole host of ways that you can work to set boundaries for cell phone use. You can work to perhaps turn off the cell phone at dinner time so that it's not disrupting family time. These are all ways that you can work to minimize the intrusive impact that modern day technology has created in terms of our ability to listen more effectively and effectively communicate with people in relationships. Now, in terms of distractions, we have internal and external distractions. The cell phone is obviously an external distraction. You might have other types of distractions, such as a television, the radio might be on, you might have noise or heat issues. But there are also internal noise or internal distractions that might be cognitive or emotional, right? So whenever you are in a conversation where you know that you need to be listening effectively, it's always good to try to do your best to address or eliminate the distractions that could prevent you from listening effectively before you engage in a conversation with people. In addition, another good strategy to being a more effective listener is to try to refrain, whenever possible, from premature judgment. What this means is that when I engage in conversations with people, I am going to work to listen first. And if I don't understand, I'm going to ask questions so that I can clarify. And second, I'm going to work to see if I understand what they're saying. If I don't understand what they're saying, I can paraphrase and ask follow-up questions so that I genuinely understand what they're saying. And then once I listen and I feel that I have a general understanding of what the person is attempting to say, then I can evaluate. Now, what we need to be careful of is the human tendency to judge before we have really understood, right? So sometimes what we do is we listen, we fixate on a piece of information, and we judge, and then we're not really even hearing what the person is saying once we have heard a certain piece of information, because we are stuck thinking about that information, and we're basically waiting to respond to that first piece of information, which basically means that all the other information that comes after it does not really get included, right? So refraining from premature judgment is not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it is something that you can do when you develop the ability to become a good self-monitor. And we talked about self-monitoring at an earlier chapter, and the ability to self-monitor is very useful in terms of effective communication with other people. And hopefully this is a skill that you folks have been working on. And so becoming aware of, for example, the moment at which you start to judge a person, right? And then being able to maybe step back, take a few steps back, and try not to be in a judgment stage, and rather try to go back to the listening stage, ask some questions to see if you really understand them before you jump to a judgment or a conclusion, okay? Another way to listen more effectively is to work to identify the key ideas that someone might be saying. So we can look, for example, at the content. What is this person talking about? We can also look beneath the content at the relational needs or the relational messages, right? So for example, somebody might be telling us that they are feeling that we spend too much time working and don't spend enough time at home with them. Okay, that could be the content. However, the relational message of a statement like that is deeper, right? The relational message of a statement like you spend too much time at work and you don't spend enough time at home with the family means basically that me and the family, or me and the children, are feeling neglected, right? So we can look at the content, we can also look at the relational issue being discussed, and then of course, ultimately what we want to do is listen for information so that we can assess a situation holistically, right? Holistically in its entirety with all the information, our own perspective, another person's perspective, perhaps the perspectives of other people that are not in the conversation with us. And once we are able to do that, then of course we can identify what are the needs of these people, or what are our needs in this relationship or in this family or in this workplace, right? And how do we develop a plan to effectively meet the needs of everybody involved? As I've stated before in this class, mutual satisfaction, relational satisfaction, is a very important part of effective interpersonal relationships. So generally speaking, it is in our best interest to learn how to be effective listeners, because when we are able to listen effectively to people, then we are able to meet their needs more effectively because we're able to understand what is required of us. Likewise, when we become good listeners ourselves, we can model good behavior for other people in our family or in our friend or in our work group who maybe are still working on becoming better listeners. And when we really give people the attention that they need and want in terms of listening, it might surprise you that people will actually turn around and want to give you the same respect. So listening is something that can be very effective in terms of improving the relational climate. It also is very important in terms of making people feel that they're validated and important in a relationship. And so listening is a very important part of effective relationships. And I hope that this lecture has provided you with some useful tips for how to listen more effectively. Before we wrap up the lecture, I also want to mention that I do expect you folks to read over the various types of listening responses that are mentioned in your textbook. And there are about 10 or 11 of them. So please do make sure that you look over the different types of listening responses, okay, so that you can make sure that you are making informed choices about effective listening responses in various types of conversational situations that you find yourself in. Thank you for your time. I hope that this lecture was useful for you, and I will talk to you all in the next lecture.